All right, hey guys, this is Brock Glidwell and Tyler Stilley with Pearson-Kelly. Today we're going to talking about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is the school budgeting process for IT in schools. So if you don't know, I have a background in IT administration for a school district. Tyler also has some similar experience in an organization that has a lot of the same budgeting practices as well as the same concerns. So we're just going to be talking a little bit back and forth here about some of the things that we're seeing and some of the things that we think that if we were in your shoes that we want to be aware of moving forward. So the first thing I'm just going to talk about is just the school budget cycle. So this is a really tough thing to get around for a lot of administrators and directors um, because a lot of times the fiscal year is July 1 to June 30. And so when you have that situation, if funds are released late in the summer, your turnaround time in a school district is really, really slim to get those projects up and running, get those machines installed that you've budgeted for. So one of the things that I did that really helped me out with that was I actually kind of built in some gap time. So I would buy in the spring for that fiscal year. So I would leave everything kind of sit. I had to do 1 year where it was kind of like we went without, for that summer where we didn't do any big projects. But when that spring came around, then I was able to stockpile all the machines and all the projects that I had ready to go. That was the biggest thing that helped me get a handle on my budget and not have to play that game of trying to turn things around really quickly. Tyler, in your experience, did you guys have any of those concerns or those struggles?
Well, I mean, from my experience in budgeting came primarily from a healthcare background, but similar process. I mean, budgeting was always something that was quite difficult just because it was hard to forecast what the next year was going to look like from both kind of an income perspective as well as what challenges were going to come up to sell, to get products to, or like what things may be needed. But I would say it's a very similar process. Yeah, I mean, always kind of working with leadership and trying to convince them or explain to them the value of what the initiatives were that we were pursuing.
Yeah, the other big challenge that's probably bigger right now than it's ever been, which our first topic that we're gonna talk about is just physical machine refresh and hardware, is supply chain right now is brutal. And I know Tyler and I have had many discussions over the last few weeks, just lamenting availability and cost of equipment. It's just really, really tough right now. And so that has ripple effects. You might think, well, we're going to be good in June. We should be good to go. But just keep in mind, everybody is sitting on major back orders, just like you. So when they start allocating those devices and start putting those shipments out, you really want to make sure you have good relationships with your manufacturers and vendor reps to where you are at the top of the list and you make sure you actually get your stuff in a timely manner. What have you noticed about supply chain in general?
Well, I think a lot of it, there's a couple of challenges that are happening right now. One is we're coming off the heels of COVID, of course. So supply chains were significantly disrupted throughout COVID just due to staffing and lack of demand in some cases and logistics. But on top of that, there's also something called a semiconductor shortage, which is happening right now. And the semiconductors are made in very few locations and have some very strict requirements around them. But a semiconductor is required to be used in basically any sort of computational device, chip, something of that nature. So your cars, your computers, almost anything that has any sort of electronic in it requires a semiconductor. Even the facilities required to make semiconductors use semiconductors and the hardware there to be able to create them. And there's massive shortages of semiconductors right now, which is causing exorbitantly large delays for any sort of electronic devices. They just can't build them. And it's made national headlines. Even the White House has talked about it. It's a very huge process that doesn't have an easy way or a quick way to just turn a switch on or off to fix. And that is causing the price of hardware to go up dramatically because the supply is shrinking everywhere. On top of that, people are coming off of COVID, vaccinations are going out. People are beginning to kind of return to work. And as part of that, revenues are increasing, things are beginning to speed back up, the economy is picking back up. So that demand has increased significantly. So the two of those together has made for a very dire situation when it comes to purchasing electronics right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And um, I know I've talked to a lot of friends that are trying to procure right now different hardware, and the shock of what you thought might be, an $800 device, to go look and see, oh, that device is now $1,200, and you can't get it for 3 months. It's hard to get past, and that's why it's really important to kind of have a contingency plan. So the first thing we're going to talk about as a topic is machine refresh or hardware refresh. So keep in mind, I'm talking mostly about end user devices, workstations, laptops, any of those type of devices. And I think it's really important that you kind of have a good understanding of what type of use you're going to get out of those machines and how long you can expect to get those machines to be usable. In my experience, we tried to replace 20%, which put us on a 5-year rotation um, on Chromebooks and laptops and desktops for all of our staff, faculty, and staff at the school district. Why that's important when you kind of combine that with the supply chain issues and all that is then at that point, as those numbers come in higher, you're not just going back to the drawing board. You can lower and raise your threshold. You can just say, okay, maybe we can't do 20%, maybe we can do 15%. But that gives you the ability to kind of not just be punching in the dark, and saying, well, what can I get? How many can I get? Is to really have that target that you're shooting for, that's your benchmark, that every year, you ask for these devices to be replaced. One of the tough things that I've learned, and I don't think it's isolated just for school districts, is getting decision makers, whether it be school boards, operating boards, owner boards, any type of leadership team, is to understand. And I know you've dealt with this too. Is the cost of running things till they die. Running things till they are such a problem that you've created 10 other problems. Because it is kind of tough sometimes. You feel like, well, why do I need to replace it if it still turns on? Right. And this is something we talk about in our own organization, is what's that threshold? Everybody's got a different tolerance for pain. So when we're thinking about budgeting for these machine refreshes, I think that's why it's really important to make sure that you're communicating clearly to your money people, to your, the purse strings, that here's why, right? We don't just want to replace 20% because we want you to spend more money. There's a significant impact for the end user and for productivity in general.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's a lot that goes into a refresh cycle when you're replacing hardware, and generally speaking, leaderships and executives of companies don't say no without merit. They have to understand why generally, and this can be a difficult task, especially if you have budgeted and created a proposal for them, and they've said, yep, we agreed to it, and then you come back and year one and say, hey, there was this unforeseen shortage. The cost of hardware has dramatically skyrocketed. They'll understand that, but that's they've made projections based upon that. And so being able to be flexible and understand, hey, the plan is always a target, but it can be adjusted as you go forward, right? I mean, there's maybe we don't get 20%, maybe we get 10 or 15, as you said. But that's when that conversation comes up, right? The conversation of, hey, it still works. I don't have any issues with it. It works fine for me. Why do we need to replace it? It seems perfectly fine. I've had it. I like it. I don't even think I want a new machine. And that's when we have to start talking about things like security, right? I mean, at that stage, whenever we're looking at hardware as they begin to get older, the manufacturers don't support them. They become significant risks to security of the network. So it's not just getting the old and failing hardware out, which is obviously one of the primary reasons for doing it, but it's also to keep the hardware current, supported, and in a configuration that is good for security to protect your network from attackers or exploits or things like that. And I can only imagine being in a school, they're pretty heavily targeted, and they've got a wide number of users that could be targeted throughout that process. So underscoring those points helps reinforce, even whenever unexpected situations happen, why you have to still continue with it. Because I have personally been in a situation where it's like, well, you know what, let's just forego it this year, and then we'll catch up next year. And then next year rolls around, and they go, we'll do the 20%. You're like, well, but that's okay. That means we're we're a little
Still
behind, right? And then as you get closer to your 3 or 4 or 5 year mark, you're like, well, hey, we have to spend a lot more to catch up, and they're like, oh, that's not going to work, right? So making sure that that is communicated very clearly, and they understand, hey, things happen, but we have to adjust along the way, and this is why. I think is a very big piece of making sure that the executives and leadership understand that and can help create budgets around it themselves or forecasts.
Absolutely. I was going to make a note that we made it 8.5 minutes before the CISO reference security, which is pretty good. We made it pretty far into it. So no, it's
I was
absolutely
holding
right.
back.
Say what?
I was holding back.
Yeah, yeah, he's contractually obligated to mention that. Hey, one thing that I did want to, you brought a good point when you're communicating and talking about these refresh cycles is something that can help you as a tool in there to adequately get your point across is we're trying to keep those big waves from happening. The big, hey, we need to replace all of our machines. It's going to be a giant spend. We're trying to get that to be a lot more predictable. That's not to say, like you said, that global pandemics and supply chain shortages aren't going to make those things move, but it's not going to be like these massive jumps and swings where you have to just bite the bullet and replace 90% of your fleet all at one time. And that's what we're really trying to get away from, that more predictable spending. You led us perfectly into the next one that we want to talk about for schools to be aware of, and that's endpoint protection. You kind of came at it from the hardware perspective of, hey, these old machines do provide opportunities for bad actors to take advantage of machines that are no longer patched or no longer updated through either the manufacturer or through Microsoft alike. One of the things that we are seeing industry-wide, it doesn't matter if you're a school district or not, but schools are being targeted as well, is that ransomware is just not going away. In fact, it kind of got quiet there for a little bit, and then about halfway through the last year of COVID, it really took a hit, and it's even hit mainstream. We're hearing about it on CNN, and it's leading stories. School districts are really easy targets, and I can probably do a whole nother hour webinar on why school districts are easy targets. But typically it's because there's just not a lot of funding and resources available to have sound security, either resources from a personnel perspective or resources from a time perspective. So talk a little bit about what schools need to be aware of, and also how they can start to maybe low spend, but start to kind of harden themselves, or at least be aware of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Ransomware has become kind of the de facto attack because it's so profitable. I mean, that's why if the attackers made no money at it, it wouldn't be nearly as dominant in the industry as it is. But the truth is, a lot of people, they don't have quality backups, or they don't have any way to restore from a disaster, like having all your files encrypted. And they just pay. They just pay the money and hopes that they get their data back because they're held hostage. I mean, it's why it is called ransomware. And the large success of that has caused it to become much harder to detect. Everyone is kind of doing it now, so there's a collaborative effort to make sure that these malicious actors and software are harder to find and harder to detect, so that they can get more people infected. It's a challenge for schools or any sort of agencies that are out there that don't have strong security budgets or just strong IT budgets, because it takes a fair amount of spend sometimes to get some of the best tools that help against things like ransomware. But it's not to say that a tool is always the number one answer. I mean, a lot of the ways that people get infected by ransomware is because someone clicked on a link in an email that maybe they shouldn't have. They went to a website and they saw a security alert, but it said something about payroll, so they thought it was important, so they continued on. So what I always recommend that is, can still be part of it, but should be a part of every security program is in-user training. That's where you have to start, especially in a school. You've got so many people who are coming into your network and visiting and things like that. You've just got a ton of points for an attacker or someone to try to come in. Is making sure that you have staff who are trained, who understand the technology to look for issues and errors, know what to click on, not what they shouldn't click on, and who to report. And if nothing else, if it looks like it's something that maybe isn't right, to just ask a question, ask something or ask a person before you click on it, even if it is legit, even if it costs you a half a day or something to pay a bill, it's better than having your entire network compromised. That said, though, there are plenty of endpoint protection products that are out there that are getting more advanced. They're beginning to use things like artificial intelligence to detect behavioral patterns rather than just use things like signatures and traditional, detection methods to find these things. And they're getting really good at it. But as we've learned, we have taken machine learning to help find what the bad actors are doing and detect them when they're doing something they shouldn't. The attackers, however, have decided to take the machine learning that we are using to create these products and use them for their own purposes to help avoid detection. So for every step we make, the same tool can be used to help avoid detection as well. So it's a constant battle. That's why it's difficult to stay ahead. Training is fantastic and one of the best tools you can do, but it's a layered approach. You need that. You do need security, and you need someone who can kind of be there. I mean, an end user who doesn't click on something does not protect you from a machine that's not been patched, right? I mean, that's something that's open and exploitable and detectable on the internet. It doesn't require a user to engage in a behavior or activity at all. So it takes a village, if you will, to do this. It takes quite a bit of coordinated effort, but the best security in the world can be defeated by someone clicking on the fake GPS link.
Yep. Yeah, and you're exactly right. So if you're thinking, if you're an IT administrator or IT director, or in a smaller school, you might be the computer lab teacher that's also in charge of you might be your G Suite administrator, that you're kind of overseeing that maybe a volunteer or stipend basis. Everybody's kind of got different level of resources available. One of the things to kind of think about is when you think about, okay, what's our budget for security, you probably don't have that line item if you're in a school district. You just probably don't, but you probably do, and you just don't know it. When you talk about machine refreshing, like that's part of your security budget. Like you're spending money actively to make sure that you don't have machines out there that are out of date. So it's equally important to buy new machines, but make sure that you have a good process for offboarding those machines. School districts, I can tell you this, there might be somebody listening to me right now that's had this conversation with me in my past life, but getting old machines out of people's hands is very tough. And sometimes you just have to make a process and say, listen, I know it. You coach my kid's team, and I know you say, I'm just gonna use this, as a second device. You've got to have that process to get those out. It's pointless to do all that work if you're not going to collect those. And then the other part of it that Tyler kind of touched to, there are some tools out there. And combining some of those tools with a training program at the building level can really help you, start to get a firm grasp on what you have out there. It's going to take me into my next point to look at when you're thinking about your budget, thinking about next year, and that's software and subscription. So I'm going to come at it really quick from just a budget perspective, and then I'll bring Tyler in here in a second to talk about how this ties into the security that we were just talking about. So if you are in a school district, and probably any industry or vertical right now, you're experiencing the as a service boom. And that means things that you used to, one off and buy a license for 5 years or whatever, is now a monthly cost or a yearly cost. So that has wrecked budgets. And I've seen it everywhere where it's like, man, this is astronomical. In a school district, this is one of the things we talked about is things that used to be textbook budget are now moved over to IT budget. There's curriculum costs now. So making sure that whenever you guys do approach your budget, that you understand and you have that understanding from your organization that just because it runs on a computer or just because it plugs in, like make sure you're exhausting your options for funding those things, because a lot of times there is curriculum money, and you might be paying for a high school math curriculum and not really know it because it's an app or it's a resource. So make sure that you're having that conversation with your entire leadership team, to where you understand where these different pots of money are. One of the things I would be doing as I'm looking over my budget for next year for software and subscriptions is I'd also take this time to look at the terms and services of those agreements that you are under. Quite frankly, you should have done this before you signed it, but I understand a lot of people don't have that ability, or maybe don't have that knowledge or the time to read through those agreements. The reason I bring this up is because anytime we're sending student data or family data anywhere, a lot of times you think, well, we don't host it, it's not on our servers, which I'm getting ready to talk about here in just a second, that it doesn't matter. What are your vendors and what are your software vendors doing with the data? So it's really, really important to take some time to understand those agreements as you're going through that. I find budget time to be a really good time to do that, because that's also the time that if you find some major problems, you're at a position where you can deal with those, either find an alternative or push back on the vendor and say, hey, you need to check your policy, or we need to amend this agreement.
For sure. So I mean, there's a lot that goes into this whole process, right? I mean, we touched on quite a bit there, but when we start talking about the hardware and why the hardware is important, but what's beginning to happen in our environments now is the software that's combined with the hardware, like your operating system, like Windows. They've begun to implement strategies that say we will only support, hardware that's up to this age. So the two of those things go hand in hand now, right? I mean, making sure that your software is current ensures that when you get a new computer, that the software is going to work on the new computer, when it comes down to operating systems, that they're going to be compatible together. And two, at a certain age, the vendor says, hey, we're not releasing security updates for this anymore, right? This is, we can't maintain every version forever, and we're just not supporting that anymore. So if you're at a point now where you're kind of behind the curve and your hardware's too old, if you update the hardware, the new operating system, you can't buy the new software without it working on the old hardware. So you have to kind of do both. So that's why this strategy of making sure you replace over time keeps your devices current and keeps you out of that, there's nothing I can do, I have to replace everything to be able to satisfy this new software requirement when it comes to it. But as you talked about a second ago, one of the things that get evaluated at this point is I've got a lot of things. I've got a lot of servers. I've got a lot of desktops, endpoints that I need to protect, and that's going to be a decent, heavy investment. Should I buy all brand new stuff and invest heavily on that, or should I look at going to something like a cloud service? And if I do go to a cloud service, that's one of those times where you evaluate and say, hey, what are they going to do with my data? If I decide to cancel the service, how do I get my data back? What format do I get my data back in? Are they protecting my data in accordance with the requirements that I have to? Any sort of regulatory requirements? Do they understand the business that I'm a part of? And the data that I have to protect, depending on what type of data you're putting up there. But the biggest thing is that running on legacy or unsupported operating systems like Windows XP, Vista, things of that nature, 7, is a major security problem. Even old server versions, replacing the hardware is not just enough. You have to do both, and you have to make sure those servers and devices stay both current from a hardware perspective, as well as from a software perspective. Otherwise, you incur massive risk. And that is where something like the cloud can be a very attractive component. Did you explore any cloud services in your experience, Brian?
Yeah, we did, and that was always the talk. And the big problem, you said a couple of things that sparked me. And the big problem in school districts is you have your ops expense and your capital expense. And the big problem is a lot of times things that used to be kind of capital money, where you'd pay for, this server, and you'd pay for this software license, and you could do that with that capital money, that kind of one-time hit. You ask for it in the budget and you get it approved and you go and you're good for a little bit. It's that shift to operational expense that can be very tough. It's like, all right, so now you want to spend 10 grand a month on this, and there's 10 others, and I think that was the big challenge. Is literally almost every education vendor out there had hosted service, had the cloud opportunities, or would work with you in your cloud instance, to virtualize your own servers and stuff like that. So it just became that, okay, where's this money coming from? And if we add this money in, then where are we going to take it out from? The other thing that you brought up, talking about the hardware constraints when you're from a budget perspective, is in Missouri, what drives a lot of schools to replace their Chromebooks and keep those Chromebooks up to date are the standardized testing mandates. So Google, they have partnered with all different types of manufacturers to provide those Google Chromebooks to run the Google OS software. The problem is they have an end of life where they will stop sending updates for those. So depending on where you're at and what type of testing software you're using, they will also put those, they will confine you to, hey, only truly supported operating systems will be able to operate these tests. So that was a huge problem for a lot of people that got caught off guard, because when the one-to-one boom hit, everybody got either grants or they got a school bond issue, or included it. So they bought them all at once. And so then to turn around and you're halfway through the year and find out that the software test that you're wanting to run, whether it be map testing or otherwise, EOC testing for the high school grades, you're not going to be able to do that on those Chromebooks. That's a really, really tough decision or a tough conversation to have after the fact. So it's really, really important. We kind of harped on it, but I think it's really important to understand those downstream effects to not keeping your hardware up to date. It's probably one of the single most impactful things you can do from an IT budget perspective. Is to keep those things up to date. So we kind of touched on server consolidations. I don't want to beat that up, but I think that taking that time, during your budget prep to find out, first off, what has to be on-prem and why. How much do we need it? What does it perform? And is everything up to date in that aspect? Also, what opportunities do we have to move things off the server? Because like we just got done talking about how expensive hardware can be and how tough it can be to acquire. So I think those things kind of go hand in hand when you're looking at your servers and what all do you have running on them? Is there anything that can be, budget neutral or minimal impact to move that to a company's hosted solution? I think that's a good time to have that conversation.
So one thing that definitely kind of sparks a little bit of interest to me, we talked a lot about the hardware, we talked a lot about the security and why it's super important, getting these things done and making sure that they're being done. But one thing that I've personally experienced as a challenge as well is that it's great and it's easy to say that all these things have to be done and they're extremely important, but there's only so many hours in the day. I mean, there's only so much I can personally do, you can personally do. When you were kind of in this role, and when I was in this role as well, it was not crazy for us to go, hey, we can't do this in this time frame. It's just not possible. We need some additional help. We need to engage outside resources, or we need to augment in some ways, which would be kind of part of that budgeting process. How did you account for that, or did you account for that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Because there was a lot of times when you think about budgeting, like you're just thinking about the money, right? And you're thinking about, okay, it's going to be a fight, it's going to be a challenge. But a lot of times you'll find that the money is there, and so then that's like the first battle. Okay, the money's there. Now what? We actually have to buy it, procure it, receive it, put it in inventory, deploy it. And I mean that getting the money is actually turns out to be one of the easier parts of the whole thing. So that was one thing that we dealt with a lot. I could think of one instance where we were dealing with classroom audiovisual, and we didn't have the time, the manpower to get this solution deployed at the scale we needed to. So we were able to utilize a third party to come in, and kind of partner up with us and say, hey, what does the scope of this look like? So we were able to set them loose and do the kind of repetitive, just over and over. They got a lot of the things set up, and then we could kind of do the onboarding, make sure that they were enrolled in the correct organizational units and all that type of stuff. It was a huge benefit, and I think the important thing is if you have that, account for those things when you're asking for money or when you're reserving pots of money. Look at what's your time going to be. If you don't have the time, if you already know there's no way we're going to be able to get this done in 2 weeks, then you need to make sure that you budget for some money, get some quotes, find out what it'll be to get somebody to come in and help you out, so you don't have to go afterwards and say, hey, we got it, but we can't get it done. Like, that's a really easy way to lose credibility with leadership. I've seen it happen to a lot of people.
One thing I might touch on to that as well, I mean, we talked about whenever you're sending your data to a cloud service to make sure that you know where that data is at and how it's protected. While not exactly the same, when you're engaging a third party, you want to take care of the same precautions. You want to make sure that the third party you choose understands the business you're in, understands the data they'll be working with, and that third party is aware of the security requirements, the compliance requirements. It's easy to get a lot of people who are willing to help, but not always understand what they're working on or what they're working with. So making sure that you pick a vendor that understands your requirements, understands how to handle those things, and has processes established and ready to help assist for your area. I mean, we see that a lot where people just come in and they're just willing to help. They're IT guys. They've done a lot, but sometimes make the issues worse when it comes down to an audit or being looked at later on when someone goes, hey, you did this with this third party. Did you verify them? Did you make sure that they had good policies, procedures? What were their response tactics and things of that nature? Can be overlooked, especially if you're in a scenario where you need it and you need it quickly, right? I mean, because it's always right now. It's rarely it's always a reaction most of the time, but making sure that you just pick quality vendors that understand that and can easily showcase and demonstrate that they understand the security and compliance requirements.
100%. And I think a couple of things that might help with that is to, one, don't die on the hill alone. If you can get a few people in on that decision, and make sure you get some different perspectives on it, why you're doing it, who you're picking, come to a consensus. That's always better than just kind of going on it alone. You can, worst case scenario, spread the blame around if things go wrong and say, hey, we were all on this together. But really, I think the point is to get those various perspectives. Because a lot of times you as an IT director might just be looking at the outcome, where somebody with a security mindset might come in, just like Tyler just did, and say, have you thought about X, Y, Z? The other thing that can help is make sure, one of the things I always try to do is anytime I stepped out of my vertical, so anytime that in education that I needed to bring a vendor in that didn't primarily work in education, I had to really take time to vet that and make sure that, even more so than any vendor, to make sure that they understood our business. Just like you said, schools are a business, but they operate completely different than your average law firm or construction or manufacturing entities. So a lot of times I found comfort whenever I knew that this vendor worked in education and higher ed. That helped me kind of be at ease, so I can feel better about my decision, that they've got some background and kind of understand. The last thing I want to talk about today is just alternate means of funding. And I think everybody kind of has different perspectives on this, because there's grants. There are, school districts can do bond issues or levy increases. There's a whole lot of ways to come up with money, especially at the school district scenario. I always tend to take these with a grain of salt. Like my rule of thumb is, if you get a grant, you get that one-time purchase, understand that, just like we talked about, that purchase is going to wear out. Do you have a securing mechanism to fund that when that wears out? right? Like you get a grant and you go out and buy 20 computers. Okay, cool. In 5 years, are you going to be able to replace those? Is there going to be money in the budget? So teachers are very resourceful. And they will go out and do a lot of teachers pay teachers and a lot of these educational grants that a lot of the cities do, which I think anytime you can involve other entities and you can bring other sources of funding in, it's a good thing. But I would make sure you have a process to vet those before they happen. And make sure that you account for those in your budget, even if it's not a line item that's that takes away from your bottom line. Maybe out to the side, be like, hey, here's all this stuff that was bought with grant money, just as an aside. The other thing to really be aware of is E-rate, and that's a whole nother ball of wax, but you can get up to 80% of your internet and your internal connections funded by the federal government. With that, there's a ton of paperwork and red tape. So I would reach out to somebody that's had some experience with that. There are a lot of folks around that can help you, navigate those waters and understand a little bit better what you're up against. But yeah, so guys, we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of maybe the hidden challenges, because it's really easy to just say, okay, well, I need 50,000 for computers and 10,000 for access points. But there's really, it's all in the cracks there, kind of understanding the other places where you can get bit from a budget perspective. So I appreciate everybody that watched. Tyler, do you have any parting thoughts for us today?
No, I think it's great advice. I mean, budgeting is always a challenge because it's a moving target, especially when there's these hidden pieces, like security. It's not clear in front of you. It's not a tangible object, but it's super important. But no, I think it's a great conversation. Appreciate everyone for tuning in.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later.